Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Big rumours today on the development of two of the most important challenges for the upcoming season. Ferrari believe their new car is behaving differently in the wind tunnel. Whether that's positive or negative though remains for you guys to decide in the comment section below. But also Mercedes believe they found a new way to try and generate more straight line speed from the W15. It's a problem that's plagued the car for the last couple of years. One of the big Achilles heels in a straight line, especially when compared to the Red Bull. They believe they have a solution away from the zero pod now to make the car significantly faster in a straight line. Very much interested your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate it. First of all, I wanted to mention this was going on from Toto as well on all the FIA drama of a couple of days ago. We saw Susie Wolff responds, Mercedes responded, even like Hamilton responded. Toto didn't really say much until today, where he calls them out for effectively a personal attack, saying the following: after 10 years as team boss, I'm already used to hearing these things, but this story was shocking. I'm caught in the crossfire. That's not a problem for me. I've developed a thick skin and I can take it. But when you go after my family, his wife in this case, it's a different level. An absurd accusation was created out of nowhere. It was a personal attack that crossed a red line. Susie and I are professional enough to keep our different fields of expertise apart, and I also don't really see where our work has much overlap with each other. So interesting statement because, you know, which is true, right? He obviously works in Mercedes, Formula 1 side owner over there. Susie Wolff is working for Formula 1 Management Group over managing the F1 Academy program. The idea would be that, you know, sure, their respective roles are very different for their respective organisations, but in theory, at least the FIA was investigating the possibility that some sort of transfer of information was happening that maybe shouldn't have been. Of course, the case was then dropped, the investigation was dropped. Mercedes and Toto Wolff, I think, made it rather clear a few days ago that they will be pursuing legal action on this. And I think these words here from Toto Wolff do definitely not, you know, they're not backing down from that potential eventuality. There was a bit more drama as well with Alpine. I don't know if you guys saw yesterday, but David Brivio, who was brought in a couple of years ago, was let go or parted ways mutually. Just another very talented individual that's been there for not very long and is now gone. And even Will Buxton says, an abject waste of a brilliant man's time, bringing in someone of Brivio's caliber to run an F1 team had everyone in the paddock excited, but that potential was quickly neutered by baffling politics. If that doesn't just sum up Alpine, I don't know what does. These are, by the way, all of their team principals in basically the last 3-4 years. It's not been a great time for Alpine, to be honest. In addition to all of these names, which are kind of similar as some of them at least, but in addition to that, we've got Alain Prost, Fernando Alonso, Oscar Piastri, Pat Fry as well, who's gone to Williams. Many key figures in the last 2 years that Alpine have lost. So I don't know where this rebuild is coming from, but it's an absolute mess there internally, even more so than Ferrari. And we'll see in a second. Leclerc had to say in the same interview, we'll see a quote from in a second, he was saying that internally at Ferrari, you know, things are moving in a good direction really, in terms of politics and not blaming each other and this type of stuff. I'm not sure that applies to Alpine at all, and Pat Fry is now at Williams, probably going to do a pretty good job there for the foreseeable future. We did see yesterday Logan Sargent was 21st on the race fans driver rankings. We saw Sergio Perez was 20th, which is, you know, I still think it's kind of harsh, but we'll see the drivers they put above them. So Stroll got 19th. I definitely think you can go the other way on that one. 18th went to Kevin Magnussen, who was comprehensively outperformed, I think, this season by Nico Hülkenberg. Very impressively so from the Hülkenberg perspective. And, you know, Hülkenberg was in Q3 as many times as Perez was. Something like that. So maybe it's not, probably not quite to that extent. But they out-qualified each other a similar amount of time. So Hülkenberg definitely up the list even further. Ricciardo got 17th, which is probably fair enough as well. Of course, he had the Great Mexico. We didn't really get to see what he could have done at tracks like Singapore because, you know, he broke his hands, had to step away from it a little bit. So maybe it's tough to justify Ricciardo too much higher than this. And Tsunoda did generally have the better of it. But obviously an exciting possibility for next season, right? How he could get on in the Red Bull if that actually comes true as the present rumours indicate. Now, Giuliano De Kester and Formula Uno have come out with some interesting discussions on some of the key challenges for next season. The Red Bull's going to be the favourite, no doubt, but the Ferrari, the Mercedes, the McLaren should be up there. Aston Martin, we'll talk about them a little bit more in a second. But Ferrari are quite interesting at the moment, especially when you get these type of statements from Carlos Sainz, that the car is behaving differently. This is kind of all he said on it. There was a longer quote where he went on to say that, well, we won't really know until the car turns up on track. There's very strong features of last year's car we want to retain, but he says it's behaving differently. Now, this comes at quite an interesting time because this isn't necessarily positive or negative, but I wonder what Charles Leclerc thinks. And actually, Charles Leclerc's statement is as follows: I'm 100% convinced that we will take a step forward next year, but everything in the sport is relative. If Red Bull finds another second, everyone else will look old. You can never be sure. Compared to Red Bull, we're not talking about a tenth or two, many tenths in race trim. That's a lot of work. But he says, I believe we can catch up, and right now he's 100% convinced that the car's going to be significantly better. Carlos Sainz, his statement was, it behaves differently. And I wonder whether this has anything to do with the rumours that next year's car will be developed effectively for Leclerc. This season was a very interesting one at Ferrari because at the start of the year, Leclerc was good compared to Sainz. Then they realised that if they set their car up to be more understeery, it just performs better in general. So that's what they did for many races until Suzuka. And during that period, Sainz got the better of Leclerc on many occasions and, of course, got the victory in Singapore. Suzuka, though, onwards, they brought the new floor upgrade in, which meant that Leclerc could once again have the car adapted to be a bit more pointy at the front end, which he prefers over Sainz. And all of a sudden, Leclerc was a monster to the end of the season, and Sainz was effectively nowhere compared to Leclerc. So internally at Ferrari is very interesting. And now we've got the rumours that Leclerc has this big deal upcoming, 3+2. It's going to take him until 2027, potentially 2029. Fred Vasseur, of course, him and Leclerc go way back. The rumour is that Ferrari will effectively do what they did with Schumacher, and it's like, all right, this is our man. This is the man that's intended to win a championship. And Fred Vasseur has made that very clear before, that these great teams, it's typically a great driver-team combination that work with each other. Sure, there's a second driver there for support, but with Hamilton Mercedes, with Vettel Red Bull, with Verstappen Red Bull, with Schumacher Ferrari, and countless other examples, that's pretty much how it tends to go. Fred Vasseur understands this. Ferrari might not be so keen to make this public, but it seems to be the common knowledge, really, that that's what Ferrari are targeting for the next couple of seasons. And is it maybe a massive surprise that Leclerc feels very confident in the way the car is performing in the simulations, and then Sainz is saying, well, it behaves differently? So whether that's good or whether that's bad, but I just think people were reading into this, right, to indicate that maybe Sainz isn't so happy with the balance and the way the car is being designed, and maybe Leclerc very much is. Only time will tell, but definitely one to keep your eyes on. Now, Mercedes in a similar boat, really. They've got lots to fix. It's interesting, though, that Ferrari, they are saying that, well, there's some good parts of last year's car we want to keep over. Mercedes have basically said, because that's what they did, Mercedes, in 2023. And they said, well, the W13, it's got good race pace compared to quali. It's, good tyre degradation. Let's try and keep those features. We still believe the zero pod's going to work. And then, of course, they didn't. So they've wasted a whole year. Now they're designing the car from the ground up again. And it's markedly different in basically every way. Toto Wolff says that every part of the car is going to be dramatically different. And last year's car, look, the only reason why they got P2 was because everyone else was all over the place, to be honest, because that car last year, the Mercedes, we've called it a Frankenstein before. It was a zero-pod designed car. They didn't have infinite money to change the chassis, so they were stuck with the monocoque. They were stuck with what they had, and they had to try and adapt it, but it was flawed from the beginning, and there's not much you can do on the limited budget. Next year is going to be a very different car, and as is described here by Formula Uno, a very different, much more traditional chassis and a smaller gearbox, reducing the car's overall drag. So this is the funny thing, really, about the zero-pod design, that Mercedes thought it was going to be so good that it carried a load of negatives, the zero pods. First of all, the packaging of the cooling is a big issue. Mercedes suffered, you guys probably remember, Australia 2022, Spain 2022, with overheating of the car. And it's always a concern for Mercedes. Even George Russell's had to manage it previously over even just the last few races of the season. So they knew that going for a zero pod, a much more kind of sleek design in the body, that the cooling has to be mounted slightly more vertically. It can't really be where they want it, and sure, probably a bit of an engineering masterclass in Mercedes to actually make the car still work with that crazy zero-pod shape. But they thought that was going to give them such an aero advantage that it was worth the weaknesses of the gearbox size and of the cooling requirements that affected their engine performance. So they've now realised, all right, that ain't working, let's go down a different route. But this carries many more advantages that they kind of threw away the possibility of when they had the zero pods, i.e. i.e. the cooling can be back where they probably want it, literally right next to the power unit in a more traditional spot, which probably means they can run the engine at higher rates as well. That's been another rumour that Mercedes for the new year, and even in part towards the end of this year, were able to run their engines at a higher rev range, basically just more power than they've been able to before, and that also probably applies to their customer teams as well, but that should especially be the case of Mercedes going forwards, because at the start of 2022 it was kind of unclear. Are Mercedes just down on engine power now? Because, we remember what happened at the end of 2021. They had a rocket ship engine in the car. 2022 wasn't the same story. Red Bull, sure, they made progress, the engine freeze, all of this stuff, and then also the 5% increase or the 5% of biofuel or whatever in the engine in the petrol. That seems to make a difference, but maybe it was partly just because Mercedes couldn't run their engine as powerfully just because of the setup of their car. They thought they were going to get enough benefit from the aero to offset that. It wasn't the case. Ride heights, porpoising, all of this shenanigans. But it also means they can bring in a smaller gearbox in the rear of the car. Now, I think Red Bull also have a very small gearbox in the rear of their car, which is... it can cause them problems sometimes. I think it's been said that the way they've designed their suspension means that the Red Bull has a very small gearbox, which is prone to potential mechanical issues. We've seen a couple of times this season that Red Bull and Max Verstappen had issues with the gearbox, changing gear, upshifting, downshifting, this type of stuff. But it's a risk that Red Bull were willing to take for the advantages it carries. And obviously the risk has massively paid off. This was what you might see relatively often for the last couple of seasons, where, okay, this is a bit of an outlier because Alpine had like no drag on their car in Brazil, but this is typically what happens, where you've got like the Aston Martin. For some reason the Williams were kind of slow here, but it's always relative. Sometimes teams will put more drag on, more downforce on, because that's going to make their car faster. But usually for the last couple of seasons, you'll see Red Bull run a medium to high wing because that protects the tyres. They've got great DRS efficiency, and their car is just really sleek anyway in its just aero design, so it maintains a high straight line speeds even with a bigger rear wing. So let's say in Sao Paulo, Red Bull had a 332 top speeds, Mercedes had a 323 top speeds. This is, for example, Mexico, where it's more similar, but you will typically see that Red Bull will have a good few kph advantage over Mercedes everywhere they go. And on many tracks, that is simply the difference in the lap times, especially last year, but even this year as well to some degree. Like Mexico, I think, was one example where the only lap time Mercedes lost really was just in a straight line. Like they were as fast, if not faster, everywhere else. And it was the same on other tracks as well this year, where they're just losing 3-4 tenths a lap on pure straight line speeds, which is completely unacceptable for a team like Mercedes, and they've got to figure that out, especially when Ferrari and Red Bull were basically the two most efficient teams. This was a very common trend. Again, this is from F Data Analysis here on Twitter. You'd usually see these graphs coming out at the end of the weekends, implying what's going on here. So the bottom here is mean speed, which is just, I mean, that's just lap time basically, which you can see go from left to right. And on the left-hand side, you've got top speed. On the y-axis is top speed. So in the top right-hand corner, that is the most efficient cars. The Red Bull is always in this top quadrant somewhere, pretty much. On this occasion in Mexico City, Ferrari was right up here as well. Mercedes are usually around about here, where they're, relatively fast, but not quite as fast, but significantly down on top speed. I've even seen Mercedes on these graphs as well, all the way down here at the bottom with very high drag, no top speed, but still relatively quick over the course of a lap compared to some of the lower tier competition. But this has been a very consistent trend for the last 2 seasons. It's one of the key weaknesses. Hamilton's made his point known elsewhere as well on other things they've got to solve with the car, but if they can have a smaller gearbox, and that means they can design a more sleek rear of the car, be more aerodynamically efficient in that sense, if that can gain them a good 3, 4, 5 kph on a straight line compared to the last year, on certain tracks, that's a big chunk of lap time that they've kind of been throwing away for the last couple of seasons. Of course, that's not to say that, they're going to beat the Red Bull again. There's many other things they've got to resolve. Some of them are actually, as we can see here, this is average pit stop times in 2023. Funny how far away Haas are. It's interesting with Haas because we don't see that many Haas pit stops just because nobody really cares. Like, they're usually further out of the field. We don't usually get to see, here comes Hulkenberg for his stop, just because they're not usually in the fight, but they're way out. I mean, 4.2, that's just tragic. But Red Bull average a 2.6 second stop over the season. McLaren average a 2.9. This is the thing with Mercedes. Their intention, Mercedes, has always been, all right, let's be slower but steadier. Let's do a 3-second flat stop, but make it consistent. McLaren had some rapid ones this year. Of course, they had the record as well with that crazy Piastri stop. Was it Norris Piastri? 1.80, or I think it was, right, for Norris. So, but they still average a 2.9. So this is the thing, McLaren, because they're trying to be rapid, they can also have some mistakes, and this is what Mercedes are trying to get, but they still need to be better. I mean, you're losing half a second per stop to Red Bull on average. 2 stops a race, that's a second of lap time, but that's an undercut, right? That's a big deal. It takes a load of laps for a driver to gain a second of lap time on somebody else, or a second of race time on somebody else by driving faster or whatever, or using their skill, but you can lose a second at a pit stop in a heartbeat. So that's one of the other issues that Mercedes need to think about. Aston Martin as well, they started this most recent season so well, they finished it in a lackluster manner, there's no doubt. And Aston Martin say that, well, we know what we want to do, we understand a great deal, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to turn up in Bahrain and fight for the win. Now, to be fair, everybody says this, but basically Red Bull, because they know they're going to be fighting for the win, or at least in the conversation to do so. Will we see Alonso back on a podium again next season? Hopefully that's the case. I know that he also mentioned here that he thinks that if there's any team that deserved a victory last season, it was them. Now, I guess he means deserved a victory apart from Red Bull, because they obviously did a better job than everybody did. But of all the other teams, of course, it was only Sainz and Ferrari that got the victory. Probably you can say this is fair enough. They did throw it away really in Monaco. I mean, if Alonso was slightly less cautious in his final sector in qualifying, he probably gets pole. But he thought that after his first 2 sectors, he was going to be on pole. And he thought, all right, let me just bring this car home because of what the Delta looked like. And then Verstappen had one of those mesmerizing last sectors of all time and sticks it on pole. And even then, during the Grand Prix, if they pit 1 lap sooner, I think it would have been, they would have had track position. So Aston Martin bottled it, I think, on that occasion, and Alonso maybe should have had a victory this year, but still, the 3rd place in Sao Paulo is a pretty good way to cap off the season. There's also questions that if you really do want Aston Martin to compete, if you're Lawrence Stroll, do you need a better driver than Lance Stroll? Probably, but that's probably not going to happen, let's be honest. There were rumours for a while that he was going to leave and go play tennis professionally or something like that, but that seems to have stalled for the time being. But very much interested in your thoughts in the comments below. Just wanted to mention one thing quickly. I know that a lot of you guys will have no idea what I'm talking about here, but it's relevant for Formula 1 just because this is an absolute mess, and I don't know what F1 are going to do about it. But Formula 1 also sponsor, they support an esports series, so the Formula 1 game. There's drivers that drive on the game for the teams, and these races are very entertaining to watch. Now, every year for the last several years, there's been F1 esports, or this year they call it F1 sim racing, something like that anyway, and there was a bit of a drama. They went to Sweden a couple of weeks ago for the first round of this. That's where it was being held. It's been online for the last couple of years, but, now they were doing it properly on LAN again. There was some controversy because I think they were meant to fund $1 million for the prize pool, but Formula 1 didn't want to or something, and they wanted to keep it at $750,000, or they didn't want to fund it at all. There was some friction there going on. They couldn't even they were meant to race Bahrain and Silverstone on the first weekends. That never happened. They only did Bahrain. And then today we're hearing rumours that it's been postponed indefinitely. They don't know where they're going to go next, or they did, but yet their flights weren't booked. It's an absolute mess. I don't know who exactly is responsible for this, but there's definitely some friction at the moment between Formula 1 and what they want to support and their intention of the esports series, which is really popular and followed by a lot of people. So it's a big point of frustration at the moment, and I know a lot of you guys probably don't care, but it's still Formula 1 relevant, so I thought I'd mention it because at least I keep up with it a fair bit. But very much interested in your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.